A motion to adjourn the House is deemed to have been made and seconded at this time. Therefore, the question is that this House do now adjourn. The honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 weeks ago, I rose to press the Prime Minister on placing an embargo on military exports to Israel. And tonight, I rise again as the situation has only become more dire. To restate where we are at, since October 7th, over 28,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, including at least 10,000 children. As the siege has continued, back in January, the International Court of Justice published a decision calling on the State of Israel to take 6 steps to prevent genocide in its siege on Gaza. Now, Canada is a signatory to the Genocide Convention, and so we are bound by this ICJ decision. In the meantime, Canada has continued to export military equipment to the State of Israel. When I first asked the question, I shared that in the most recent year we have records for, 2022, Canada permitted sales of more than $20 million of military equipment to Israel, which followed a record high of $26 million in 2021. In the time since, though, an access to information and privacy request by the Maple to Global Affairs has revealed that this government has authorized at least $28.5 million of new permits for military exports to Israel during the first 2 months of this siege on Gaza. Now, various ministers have denied in the media that this is the case. So I wonder if it might be the wording that they're speaking about. As an example, Israel has used F-35 fighter jets in its bombing of Gaza. And Project Plowshares on January 28th warned that some Canadian-made military components, including those found in F-35, are first shipped to the U.S. and then ultimately supplied to the Israeli military. They are destined for Israel all the same, even if through other countries. Now, we have our own laws that forbid these permits. Section 7.3 of our own Export and Import Permits Act forbids these sales if there's a substantial risk they could be used to violate international, humanitarian, or human rights law, or for serious acts of violence against women and children. In light of this, last month a coalition of legal advocates warned that it may bring a legal challenge against the federal government if it failed to halt military sales to Israel. And last week, a coalition of civil society organizations, including Human Rights Watch, Independent Jewish Voices Canada, Mennonite Central Committee Canada, and the United Church of Canada, called on this government to stop military exports to Israel, warning that, quote, there is substantial concern that some of these weapons could be enabling Israel's operation in Gaza. As we speak tonight, Netanyahu has vowed an offensive in Rafah, the last refuge for displaced Palestinians in southern Gaza. A WHO rep for Gaza and the West Bank said an assault on Rafah would be, quote, an unfathomable catastrophe and would even further expand the humanitarian disaster beyond imagination. In the midst of all this, Canada must be clear. Greens have called for this government to unequivocally call for a lasting ceasefire, for a release of all hostages, for funding to be renewed to UNRWA, and for an end to all permitting of military equipment destined for Israel. So I ask again tonight, at a time when we know Canada has permitted more than $28 million of military equipment destined for Israel in recent months, when the ICJ has ordered Israel to take steps to prevent genocide, when our own laws forbid these sales if the equipment could be used to break international law, will this government put in place an embargo on military exports destined for Israel?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the Honourable Member for his question. The violence must stop. We share an immense grief for the tragic loss of civilian life. The horrific attacks by Hamas against Israeli civilians still shock us all. Canada unequivocally condemns their terrorist actions. What has been happening in Gaza is absolutely dire. The images we are now seeing from Rafah are deeply concerning, and a military operation in Rafah is devastating for Palestinian civilians as well as foreign nationals who are seeking refuge. They have nowhere else to go. And as the minister has said, asking them to move again is unacceptable. We've also said the price of defeating Hamas cannot be the continued suffering of all Palestinian civilians. We continue to support the urgent efforts for a sustainable ceasefire. This cannot be one-sided. Hamas must release all hostages and lay down its arms, and humanitarian access must urgently be increased and sustained. I also want to reassure all Canadians that we are in regular and close contact with our allies and partners in the region, including Israel, Egypt, and Qatar. In fact, today Canada welcomes His Majesty King Abdullah II of Jordan. During the visit, peace and security in the Middle East will be an important topic of discussion, including the urgent delivery of rapid, unimpeded humanitarian relief for civilians in Gaza, support for a sustainable ceasefire, and the path towards lasting peace in the region. Canada continues to believe in a two-state solution where Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side in peace and security. When it comes to the ICJ, Canada was a founding voice and remains a strong proponent of the court's independence. We support their critical role in the peaceful settlements of disputes and their work in upholding the international rules-based order. Orders of the ICJ are binding on all parties and they must comply with them. It is for the ICJ to make a final decision on the case, and we continue to follow the case very closely. As for export permits to Israel, it's important to understand what we're talking about here. There's a wide range of items that require an export permit. These include items such as telecom equipment, decontamination equipment, protective equipment, and imaging equipment, military parts and components. There's also a wide range of end users, including academic institutions and small businesses. When we look at permits for export to Israel in particular, in recent years our government has not received and therefore has not approved any export permits for weapons. No permits for bombs, rockets, missiles, explosive devices. The permits issued since October 7th, and in fact all permits that are currently open are for non-lethal equipment. We will reiterate that there are no current permits to export weapons or ammunition. Canada has a very robust export control system. We are a state party to the UN Arms Trade Treaty and take that responsibility very seriously. The government has been consistent and diligent in the way decisions are being made on export permits, and we will continue to be. That policy has not changed.
The honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Parliamentary Secretary knows, there is no agreed-upon definition of the term non-lethal equipment. But what I can share is what Global Affairs shared with the Maple on their ATIP request. During the first 2 months of the war on Gaza, GAC issued permits worth a total of $18.4 million that covered military items categorized as electronic equipment, $9.2 million more for aircraft, lighter-than-air aircraft. The list goes on. And so if we can have a reasonable conversation to be clear that these are the permits that GAC has made clear have been issued, if that is the case, and it is the case, in light of the ICJ decision, in light of our own Export and Import Permit Act, when will this government, along with other important calls that they have made, as has been shared this evening, when will they end all permits of military equipment to the State of Israel?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And maintaining international peace and security are priority objectives of Canada's foreign policy. Civilians must be protected and international law must be respected. Canada has one of the most rigorous export control systems in the world, and it's harmonized with those of our allies and partners. And when we look at permits for Israel in particular, let's be clear. In recent years, our government has not received and therefore not approved any export permits for weapons. The permits issued since October 7th, and in fact, all permits that are currently open are for non-lethal weapons. And I will repeat our calls for a sustainable ceasefire, for more aid to get into Gaza, and for all hostages to be released. We remain committed to a two-state solution with a Palestinian state living side by side for Israel, and we firmly stand with the Israeli and Palestinian people in the right to live in peace, security, dignity, and without fear. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dauphin, Swan River, and Neepawa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Environment Minister stated that the Liberal government does not measure the annual